Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Today we're going to do another episode of the Memory Lane series, the place where we take a look back at some interesting articles and interviews from old guitar magazines. My dad has been subscribed to Guitar World magazine for about 30 years now. He saved a bunch of old magazines. He was kind enough to let me borrow some. So the one we're going to look at this time is the March 2006 issue of Guitar World magazine. Here's the cover. I'm going to read you guys an article written by James McNair about how Randy Rhoads played a short yet pivotal role in Ozzy Osbourne's storied solo career. So without further ado, let's get started. First, I want to show you guys this really dope picture of Ozzy and Randy. Hopefully you guys can see that. Alright, let's see what the article has to say. For Rhoads, young, somewhat naive, and enamored of cartoons, touring with the Osbournes was a roller coaster ride. At the band's live shows, Ozzy would hoist the tiny guitarist to his chest and carry him around the stage while Rhoads continued playing. It looked as though Rhoads was a trophy or a mascot that Ozzy could hardly bear to put down. Here, finally, was a talent to match that of Eddie Van Halen, a guitarist whose band had memorably upstaged Black Sabbath on the last British tour Ozzy had played with his former group. Looking more closely at the Rhoads/Osbourne dynamic, writers have tended to paint them as polar opposites. Here was Randy, the androgynous, polite, God-fearing kid who penned acoustic guitar instrumentals for his mom, and there was Ozzy, a tattooed ex-slaughterhouse worker who bit the heads off doves and thought nothing of taking a leak on the Alamo, the historic Texas fortress. But was Randy really the Dr. Jekyll to Ozzy's Mr. Hyde? Sharon Osbourne thinks not. Randy wasn't straight-laced at all. He was a naughty little. He wasn't so open with it as Ozzy because he didn't have the years behind him that Ozzy had, and hadn't yet had the level of success which gives people the confidence to act just how they want to. But it was all there with Randy. It just hadn't come out. Sharon recalls one particular occasion on which Rhoads' mischievous ways were on display. I remember being in a bar in the U.S. and the waitress, well, let's just say she had a stick up her. Randy said, "Okay, let's wind her up. She deserves it." He was drinking scotch, so he emptied out his glass, peed in it, and then put the ice back in. The waitress came back and he goes, "Excuse me, this scotch tastes really weird. Would you taste it?" She did, of course, and Randy was in hysterics. By now, Ozzy Osbourne's new band was growing in popularity. They'd written an acclaimed debut album, and the four bandmates were gelling into a solid unit. The live shows were selling out, and with good reason. In concert, Osbourne and his band turned into a blistering performance that thrilled audiences with its music and showmanship. Fans were even prepared to raise their lighters during Goodbye to Romance, a saccharine Ozzy ballad, which neither Rhoads nor Daisley had managed to redeem. Recalls Sharon, "When the US dates started selling out first and second night, I got that feeling in my gut and thought, oh my God, this is going to go through the ceiling." The big record company suits had no idea, but for those who knew what Ozzy's time with Sabbath had meant to people, it was a no-brainer, of course. It was going to work. In the winter of 1981, Osbourne and his new band prepared to release Diary of a Madman, the follow-up to their debut. Its camp horror cover featured a comically feral Ozzy in torn, blood-stained trousers, seemingly a reference to the dove-biting incident. The music within, though, was worthy of more serious appraisal. This was nowhere more evident than on the title track, Diary of a Madman. Beginning with a rich sequence of descending acoustic guitar arpeggios, the song built to a more demonic-sounding mash of strings, an operatic choir, and a wonderfully deranged vocal. "We got in Lou Clark, who used to do all the electric light orchestra stuff, to help with the arrangement," says Daisley. The bassist gave Clark a copy of the Carl Orff opera, Carmina Burana, which the band used as its stage entrance music. I asked him to use it as a template for Diary of a Madman. Sure enough, he came up with the goods. Behind the creativity, however, tension was increasing. At its root, according to Daisley, was a personal reshuffle proposed to the Osbournes. When we first got the band together, Ozzy had been keen to get Tommy Aldridge, Black Oak, Arkansas, Pat Travers, on drums, but he wasn't available, says Daisley. Once we'd had a bit of success in England with the first album, though, Tommy became more interested. Sharon and Ozzy kept taking me aside and saying, "Let's get Tommy in now," but I was like, "No, it isn't broken. Why fix it?" Lee was a great drummer, and the chemistry was good, and we were getting a good product. Despite the Osbournes' keen interest in Aldridge, what happened next took Daisley completely by surprise. The bassist was awaiting Sharon's phone call to confirm upcoming U.S. tour dates. When the call came, however, she had something else to say. She said, "You and Lee are out," Daisley recalls. That was it. They'd already arranged to have Tommy Aldridge and Rudy Sarzo on tour with them. Sharon Osbourne has since described Bob Daisley and Lee Kerslake as two horrible old with their beards, always moaning. She had also said Rhoads told her he would be too embarrassed to perform in the U.S. with them. Whatever the case, the die was cast long before Sharon delivered the verdict to Daisley. Basically, it was a waiting game, she says. Ozzy had always wanted Tommy on drums, and even after the very first Blizzard shows, we'd already called Rudy. We'd never met him, but Randy had turned us on to him because they played in Quiet Riot together. Rudy proved very easy to work with. He was a fabulous musician, and he looked great. In essence, says Sharon, Daisley and Kerslake were little more than hired hands employed for a pair of albums and a few shows. We wanted to get Ozzy into the studio and get those records made, she says, but we knew Daisley and Kerslake were not our ultimate guys. They were brought in and used on 2 albums made virtually back-to-back, and then they were let go. They never got over the fact that they were once part of something that got huge. But when you're a session player, that's what happens. It's pay for play, you know. When the new lineup's U.S. tour got underway, the campy horror of Diary of a Madman's sleeve was writ large in a stage show that incorporated a castle and a dwarf that Osbourne nicknamed Ronnie, after Ronnie James Dio, his diminutive replacement in Black Sabbath. The Ozzy Osbourne crazy train had now become bigger, garnished, more expensive, and more difficult to control. When Ozzy bit the head off a live bat thrown on stage at a show in Des Moines, Iowa, he had to undergo a rabies test at the local hospital. Somewhere in the midst of the mayhem, Randy Rhoads began to lose his appetite for the rock and roll circus. In the short term, Blizzard was a great break for Randy, says Daisley, but in the long term, he wasn't that interested in what this business represents. That's why he wanted to get out of it. When Ozzy found out that Randy wanted to quit the band and dedicate himself to playing classical guitar music, he punched him in the face. It was a tacky thing to do to such a little bloke. In time, the incident blew over, and the closeness of the Osbournes' Rhoads became a reality again. On the morning of March 19, 1982, however, one tragic event would change that forever. While the group and its entourage were en route to a gig in Orlando, Florida, the bus driver, Andy Aycock, made a stop at the bus company's main hub to pick up spare parts. To stay on schedule, he had driven through the night from Knoxville, Tennessee. It was very early in the morning, Sharon recalls, and he asked the tour manager, Jack Duncan, if he could swing by and pick up this stuff, and the tour manager said, "Okay." All of this was unbeknown to Ozzy and I. We were on the back of the bus, asleep. At the bus company's hub was a helicopter and airplane company with its own private landing strip, named Red Baron Airport. Upon arriving, Aycock, a licensed pilot, reportedly took a 1-engine 1955 Beechcraft Bonanza airplane from its hangar without permission. Wanting to impress the early risers among Ozzy's band and entourage, he first took Duncan and keyboard player Don Allray up in the air and soon after returned them safely to ground. He next took Rhoads and the band's seamstress, Rachel Youngblood, up in the airplane. This time, the flight went horribly wrong. Showing off for the onlookers, Aycock buzzed the band's tour bus 3 times in succession at speeds estimated at up to 140 miles per hour. On the 4th attempt, the airplane clipped the back end of the bus with its left wing. The impact sent the plane cartwheeling through a tree and into the garage of a nearby house, where it exploded in flames. We were woken up by a huge bang, recalls Sharon, and the bus was rocking backwards and forwards. Ozzy and I had no idea where we were or what had gone on. Try to imagine it. You wake up to an almighty crash and find you are in the middle of a private landing field. When we got out of the bus to see what had happened, everybody was screaming, "Randy! Randy!" We looked up, and the house nearby was on fire, and there were bits of airplanes strewn all over the place. It was a walking nightmare. It literally took us minutes to comprehend what had happened, and the minutes seemed like hours. People were on their knees on the landing strip, crying, their hands clasped to their heads. We couldn't get anything out of anybody. They were all in shock, and so were we. The crash had taken place at around 9:30 a.m. Rhoads had died instantly. He was just 25 years old. In subsequent autopsy reports, Aycock's body tested positive for cocaine. Rhoads' report was clean. Daisley says there's irony in Rhoads' decision to go up on the airplane that day. Randy would go from Chicago to Florida by bus to avoid flying. He didn't like flying. He was probably talked into having that joyride. To this day, the Osbournes feel survivor guilt, says Sharon. It's like, why wasn't I awake? Why wasn't I with him? Why couldn't we stop it? The whole time you feel responsible. And every time we see Dolores, Randy's mother, we still feel that incredible guilt. Still, many thought it disrespectful when the Osbournes hired guitarist Bernie Tom, formerly of Gillan, Deep Purple singer Ian Gillan's hard rock band, to replace Rhoads on the tour just 3 days after his death. Torm's tenure with Ozzy was brief. Since then, the singer's ongoing, still successful solo career has since seen him hire a string of other young guitar heroes, from Brad Gills to Jake E. Lee to Zakk Wylde. To a man, these musicians have tended to revere Blizzard of Oz and Diary of a Madman, the 2 Ozzy records driven by a tiny guitar colossus called Randy Rhoads. There was a lovely, lovely energy between the 4 of us when we recorded those albums, says Daisley. Nothing can take that away. It was a special time in all our lives. Randy was alive, and the rest of us were a bit more youthful and useful. To create something like that, when you listen back to it, it was so wonderful. We didn't do it for the money, and we didn't do it for the fame. We did it from the heart, and that's why those songs stand the test of time. That takes us to the end of the article. Randy Rhoads perished at such an incredibly young age, but he was still a remarkably gifted guitar player. I believed if he hadn't passed away in that plane crash, he would have easily climbed to the top of Mount Rushmore of guitarists. He was already rivaling some top names like Eddie Van Halen when he was in his 20s. He was already so impressive by the time he died. If he lived, he would have gotten even better. It's sad we never got to see Randy unleash his full potential. You know, a few months ago, I was on Reddit and I saw where Ozzy was actually answering questions from different fans. Someone asked him, "Ozzy, what's your biggest regret?" He replied, "Letting Randy get on that plane." Even all these years later, he still blames himself, at least partially, for the accident that claimed Randy's life. Even though I believe there was nothing Ozzy could have done, he had no way of knowing what would happen to Randy when he got on that plane. It wasn't Ozzy's fault. I hope eventually he can forgive himself. Easier said than done. I just hate that Ozzy has to carry that guilt with him. So rest in peace, Randy Rhoads. We all miss you. So that does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Until then, rock on.